Hello, here we are again. I'm David Scheinbaum from Scheinbaum and Russick. Today's episode we're calling Looking at Photographs Part 2. The subtitle for today's video is Making Photographs, Not Taking Photographs. And the notion of making images is a whole thread within the history of photography that really begins with the move of the Bauhaus in Germany to America. In the 30s, as things politically were heating up, many of the artists of the Bauhaus school emigrated to England or to the United States. And we have in Chicago the Institute of Design, which was started and kind of settled by a number of those Bauhaus artists, namely Moholy-Nagy, who headed the Institute of Design. The focus of the Bauhaus and of the Institute of Design, or we call ID, was an emphasis on the design capabilities of photography. It's a very important movement to us as photographers that the Bauhaus was one of the few schools that included photography in the curriculum. So to be able to emphasize design, kind of de-emphasize its ability to record detail, record minute changes of tone and contrast, we actually see a move away from the camera to a cameraless way of making images. This is done by one of the Bauhaus artists, Yuri Kepes. It's a photogram, a cameraless image, and in many ways it kind of typifies that look when we think of, making an image as opposed to taking an image. It's kind of a look that typifies imagery that was done during those years of the Bauhaus. Another image by one of the kind of chairs of photography at the Institute of Design is a photographer named Arthur Siegel. Arthur Siegel made this image, he called it a lucidogram. Now we call photographs or imagery where you're placing objects on the photographic paper and just exposing it to light, we call those photograms, as opposed to a photograph, which implies the use of a camera. So as much as this is a photogram, it was renamed a lucidogram. And I don't know how much you could see this, but if those of you who have ever used a hole puncher and punched all those holes, and you know how they get all over the floor, these actually are those little dots placed throughout the paper to produce this lucidogram. So we see this movement of design emphasis in these photographs coming from the 30s through the 40s. Two of the students of the Institute of Design who ended up then becoming teachers were the photographers Harry Callahan and Aaron Siskind. And Harry Callahan, and I should say, and there's the thing about when we make these videos, we're basically using images from our inventory. And I don't have illustrations to show you for everything I'm going to talk about. So we'll embed them into this video, or we'll put them into our newsletter that accompanies this video, which would be off our website, photographydealers.com. But you can see on this Harry Callahan, he's starting to basically lose information, to kind of put aside and start dealing with negative space in a new way. We're no longer thinking of a kind of a Ansel Adams approach where we're trying to get a full range of tone from black to white and show all the separations. We're actually emphasizing structure, shape, and form. This, of course, coincides with the abstract expressionist movement in art history, where we start to also see an emphasis on line and structure. So if we think of a painting or a drawing by Franz Kline or Robert Motherwell, where the imagery is about the gesture itself, about the way the mark is put on the paper, we see in Aaron Siskind's work not only this great parity between photography and the abstract expressionists, but Aaron Siskind is producing images also in this same style, looking for shape and form and concentrating on structure. And we're kind of giving up this notion of detail, which of course the camera is very capable of doing. But we don't need it. We're just thinking of structure. Those of you who know, who know Siskin's work, you know his photographing, peeling paint, old billboards, rotting wood. You could see in an image like this, and again, I kind of want to reference some of the abstract expressionist artists, and we very much will include the photography of Aaron Siskin within that movement. As we move into, this is basically post-World War II, you know, we're seeing this, you know, kind of giving up subject matter. It's not so much what the picture is of, but what the picture feels like, and how we're affected by the actual structure and composition of the photograph. By the 50s, we have the photographer Minor White, who's taking it even to the next level. Minor White said something about that it's not about taking pictures, it's about making pictures. And Minor also was known to say that although the camera can record superbly, it transforms better. And it's in this transformation of subject matter, not done through any technical manipulation as such, but really through the power of seeing. So when we look at Minor White's work, we start to see, again, an emphasis on composition, a de-emphasis on minute detail, and it becomes, again, less of what is the picture of, but what does it feel like? And again, here's a seemingly, I'll say, quote, regular or normal photograph. Has a full tonality. It has, you know, reference to a sunrise or a sunset in the water, but this cloud is so moving and transformative that it kind of puts an edge into the picture, and it brings almost a mystical aspect to it. And that's what Minor really was teaching. It was almost more of a metaphysical approach to making photographs. He was very influenced by the I Ching, by the philosophy of Gurdjieff. He also was very influenced by astrology and meditation. And all of these things came together in his teaching and in his work. He worked closely with Ansel Adams on the West Coast, developing the zone system. He was a friend of Edward Weston. At the same time, in 1946, at the very end of Alfred Stieglitz's life, he talked with Stieglitz about this notion of making sequences, of making equivalents. So he learned about equivalence from Stieglitz himself. And there's a great quote Stieglitz said to him upon their meeting. He asked Minor White if he had ever been in love. And Minor said yes. And he said, well, then you can photograph. And I think it's that statement, to be able to input your love for the medium into your work, that can help bring it to the next level. So when we look at Minor, again, it's not so much where we'd say, well, what is that a picture of? But it's really, what does it feel like? Or what is it of to you? Or what does it make you feel in terms of your emotional self? Minor had two primary students. One was Walter Chappell and one was Paul Caponegro. I'll mention here, as I show you the work of Walter Chappell, that Minor was very interested in other levels of consciousness, as Walter Chappell was. And in fact, it was Walter who introduced Minor White to things like the I Ching and things like Gurdjieff. So Minor started photographing with infrared film. I don't have any examples to show you, but these images taken at a wavelength of light that's beyond our vision is kind of a metaphorical image to be able to access levels of consciousness that we cannot see with our eyes, with our human eyes. So when we look at those infrared photographs, we actually are thinking that it's an attempt to go beyond in some way. Walter Chappell, and this is what I might call a straight photograph by Walter, done in Hawaii. But Walter kind of used Miner's teachings about infrared as a jumping off point for his imagery that was also produced at a wavelength of light that was beyond our vision, one in which we cannot see. These photographs by Walter Chappell are called metaflora photographs. They're produced by electricity. It's a kind of a complex process, and I'm not a scientist, but by putting live objects on a metal plate that's charged with high amounts of electricity, it seems that when those charges are at a certain point, all things that are made of protons, which is most living things, or all living things, I guess there's a moment where they turn to photons. And photons emit light. So by placing, let's say, a leaf, and this is a begonia leaf, onto a piece of film on this metal plate, charging high amounts of electricity, nothing is seen with the human eye. But when that film is developed, this is an image that would appear. So it's basically a way to see what we can't see, but the film is capable of seeing. And again, as with Miner White's infrared photographs, Walter Chappell's metaflora photographs, to me, are metaphors for being able to access other levels of consciousness, other planes of thinking that they can produce through their photographic imagery. The other student of Miner's is Paul Caponigro. Paul also was kind of influenced by Miner to photograph in a new way, where the concentration of the work is about seeing. It's about how you can transform subject matter through the power of your vision, through the power of your sight. Being able to master your photographic materials, film, development, printing and such, but produce images that go to another level. I'll just show you two or three. And again, this is an ice image. Both Paul and Walter talked about some of Miner White's early assignments to them, which are probably considered unusual today. And again, somewhat metaphysical, where they would have to photograph, let's say, the surface of water. How would you interpret that subject matter as a photograph? How would you photograph wind? How would you photograph air? These are things that would have to be interpreted emotionally and then transformed into a photographic composition. Maybe an image, or for me, that typifies Miner's teachings and this whole movement in photography, which again is kind of moving away from the discrete subject matter into a more transformative approach, would be Paul Caponigro's apple. This is called the astral apple. It's called the galaxy apple. It has a lot of different names, but it's just an apple. But is it just an apple? In a way, the whole universe is manifested within this seemingly simple subject matter. And I think this is a good example to kind of talk about the work of Miner White, Walter Chappell, and Paul Caponigro. And again, I talk more about their work and a lot of other movements, the Bauhaus, Institute of Design, in some of our previous newsletters, and I'll link those texts to the posting of this video. So if you're interested to read more about these artists or learn more about their technique, I have done previous newsletters on them, which would be on photographydealers.com. This is the work of Jerry Uelsmann. Again, in thinking about making photographs rather than taking photographs, Jerry is someone who really takes that to its definition. These images are made with multiple negatives. He has 5 enlargers in his darkroom, negatives in each enlarger, where he's bringing the paper from easel to easel around the darkroom. And you can see here that this sphere would be one negative, and these hands would be another negative, and these clouds would be another negative, the building another negative. But to be able to make these seamless, pre-Photoshop images, these are analog prints done in the darkroom, which I should also remind you, and I've written this up as well, is not a new technique. In the 19th century in photography, emulsions weren't sensitive to all tones within the spectrum between black and white. So a photographer who wanted to make a landscape was forced to make a choice. If you wanted to photograph the landscape, the sky would just go white. If you wanted to photograph the clouds in the sky, the landscape would go black. So photographers kind of figured out that they could produce 2 negatives. Make one exposure for the foreground, one exposure for the clouds, and then do what we call combination printing. Put those 2 negatives together and print them. So this is a technique that was known almost since the beginnings of photography. If you know the work of H.P. Robinson or Oscar Raylander, those were Jerry Uelsmann's influences. But to be able to take that into the 20th century and make these, what I might call surrealist photographs, is pretty incredible. And Jerry certainly is the master of being able to do this kind of darkroom wizardry and produce images not that he sees with his eyes, but that he sees with his mind. Whether they're manifested from dreams, or thoughts, or poetry, or literature, Jerry just pulls on all of these areas to come up with his subjects. And it's a pretty powerful approach to photography where you're not going out looking for your subject matter, you're actually going in and looking for your subject matter. And that's what we owe to Jerry Uelsmann, to be able to bring us to these places of his mind. Lastly today, I want to show you the work of someone who's a little more, let's say, contemporary photographer. This is the work of a Guatemalan photographer named Luis Gonzalez Palma. I understand in this video you may not be able to see these too well. Again, we'll embed them onto our newsletter to accompany this video. But Luis loves process. He also loves culture. He photographs his people. He talks a lot about the notion of love lost, about culture lost, about the influence of outside cultures on his culture. So his work is kind of dealing with so much from his roots and his country and what goes on in his life. But these are basically black and white photographs that are then brushed with an asphaltum-based varnish. It's typically a varnish that oil painters might use to put onto their oil paintings. But by brushing this varnish on and getting this brown look, and then taking, let's say, a Q-tip or cotton, I'm just making this up, I don't know exactly what he uses, but then he kind of could clean out areas just to bring out, let's say, the whites of the eyes. So it's not what we call a sepia tone print. Again, it's a regular black and white analog gelatin silver print that's then varnished, and then he goes in and cleans out certain areas. As I said, he's very into process. Another piece is done a totally different way, where he probably used a Kodalith negative, which is a high contrast black and white negative, laying it over paper that's layered with patches of gold leaf, and almost gives us the impression, I don't know if I've talked about this in these videos, but Edward Curtis used a process called the orotone, which is basically a photograph on gold. This kind of echoes that feeling of an orotone, yet Luis kind of created this process himself. He's done ambrotypes, he's done hand-applied pieces, he does pieces that he sews cloth or sews ribbon. He sometimes applies milagros onto the pieces. He's done work in color, digitally, which, think of a table with 4 legs but missing a leg, to bring kind of this magic realism to his photography. He's really a master of process. He's an amazing photographer. And again, you can learn a little more about him if you kind of access our website or kind of Google him. It's Luis Gonzalez Palma. That's about it for today. I want to thank you for joining us. We'll continue this series. For the next series, we're going to be talking about vintage and modern prints, limiting editions, special limited edition portfolios, limited edition books, and we'll talk about different ways photographers have come to the broader art market to try to produce unique works or limited works. Thanks again. Take care. Please wear a mask.